now have Professor Dan Berger, who is an assistant professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. He teaches classes on race, prisons, and social movements, and he will be discussing the Black freedom struggle against criminalization. Please help me welcome him.
All right, thank you all. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Stephanie and Relina and the other organizers. And thanks to my co-panelists for already starting us off on such a strong footing. So I want to situate and kind of continue the process of situating today's state violence historically that this panel is dedicated to, but also think about the protests that are happening now within a kind of longer arc of Black freedom struggle protests. And I set myself up for a kind of difficult task because I want to talk about some very depressing and distressing things without leading us all to despair. So I will try to end with a couple of lessons that we might learn from earlier campaigns and struggles against state violence. So the first thing to note is that the American criminal justice system has always been severe and severely racist. Recent protests have understandably targeted police brutality, but I think the target is actually much larger. Right? This is a movement against, or it is, and I think it ought to be, a movement against criminalization. Right? And by criminalization, I mean the processes that define certain behaviors, but ultimately certain people and certain populations as indecent, as dangerous, as without rights, and as deserving of punishment, up to and including murder. Right? And criminalization has expanded since the end of slavery, even as poignantly as it was written into slavery, as my colleagues here talked about. So the 13th Amendment, which was passed and ratified in 1865 and widely thought to have abolished slavery, actually continued to write slavery into the Constitution because it declared that slavery was illegal except as punishment for a crime wherein the party shall have been duly convicted. So this amendment allowed for the expansion, or at least the continuation of slavery as long as it happened under the protection of the law. As a result of this amendment, various states sort of passed laws and engaged in processes that sort of sanctioned continued servitude and confinement of so-called criminals, and lynching became the law of the land. But today, the primary mechanism for criminalization is what we might call the prison industrial complex, or the PIC for short. Right? This is a hard-to-read graph of the PIC, but you can find it online. Right? So the prison industrial complex refers to the ways that, or to the fact that prisons and police remain central to how the United States governs. Right? Politicians come and go, but police and prisons remain, and in fact have grown even more powerful over the last half century. Right? As Scott mentioned in a report by the Malcolm X grassroots movement, determined that a Black person is killed every 28 hours by police or vigilantes who remain well-armed and legally protected. But I want to talk about prisons, because I think prisons remain at the heart of the prison industrial complex. The US is in fact the world's #1 jailer. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. The US holds 2.3 million people in cages on a daily basis. Another 5 million people are under some form of state supervision, like probation or parole, and nearly 6 million people cannot vote due to a felony conviction. There are more prisons and jails than colleges and universities in this country, and they are filled overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, with poor people and people of color. More than 80,000 people are in solitary confinement, living in a cage, separated from any human contact for 23 or 24 hours a day for years on end. The United States is the only industrialized country to have the death penalty and to sentence so many people, including juveniles, for so long, up to and including life without the possibility of parole. Black youth and Black communities more generally are particularly targeted. If current conditions continue, 1 in 3 Black men born today can expect to go to prison. 1 in 9 Black men ages 20 to 34 is in prison. And Black men are imprisoned at a rate nearly 6.5 times greater than white men. And Black women are imprisoned at a rate almost 3 times that of white women. And black women who are not incarcerated still bear the brunt of prison violence, since they wind up doing the majority of the work to maintain familial and communal ties, while also surviving in a system that, as Audre Lorde put it, we were never meant to survive. The prison industrial complex emerged out of a series of domestic and global wars after World War II, and a series of wars that are really ongoing, right? So war on communism, the war on crime, the war on communism sort of commonly thought of as the Cold War, beginning immediately after World War II, the war on crime officially beginning in the mid-60s, the war on drugs beginning in 1971, and now, of course, the war on terror. Right? Each war, precisely because there's no end date, has expanded police power through surveillance, repression, and incarceration to give us the system of mass incarceration that I laid out above. So these are grim and depressing realities, but I think we should not give up just yet. Paradoxically, I think all of these wars show us, as the poet Sonny Patterson says, that we know this place. From its inception, I think the Black freedom struggle has always been a campaign against criminalization. It has identified the law as itself the problem. In the early 20th century, where lynch law reigned supreme, black women like Ida B. Wells stood up to the racial and sexual terror regimes of their day. And the civil rights and black power movements challenged criminalization on a regular basis. They recognized that the law upheld segregated housing, unequal schools, and restricted employment. The law upheld police violence and racial disparities in incarceration. And so they challenged the law. They even broke the law. Think about the most well-known civil rights activists, people like Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. All of them went to jail many times. Martin Luther King went to jail so many times that he couldn't even get arrested at protests when he tried. But it was not just that activists went to jail, right? It was that people in prison became participants in the Black freedom struggle. For nothing helps you understand freedom like living in unfreedom. Years of street protests in the 50s and 60s sparked a series of rebellions inside prisons in the 60s and 70s. Prisoners and prison abolitionists warned that prison was becoming the new normal of American racism, out of sight and yet more vicious. Imprisoned intellectual and author George Jackson wrote that, quote, that the ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prison. Jackson was arrested at age 18 in 1960 and sentenced to serve between 1 year and life in prison for a small-scale robbery. He wrote that line in August of 1971, a few days before he was killed by prison guards at the age of 29 years old. His body was then left for 4 hours in the street, in the yard of prison, before being collected. And his death sparked protests around the world. So as I said, we know this place. So let me offer 3 things that today's protests can learn from previous efforts at fighting criminalization. Number 1, don't try to perfect what needs to be abolished, or don't add to the prison industrial complex. It can be tempting to, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore sarcastically put it, tweak Armageddon, but this is something best avoided. We should be wary of reforms that extend rather than shrink the prison industrial complex. For instance, mandatory minimum sentences have done a lot to expand the number of people in prison as well as the length of time that people spend in prison. In the 1970s, people demanded more clarity in criminal sentencing. Instead, legislatures responded by expanding the prison sentences across the board for everyone, thereby helping to usher in and sustain mass incarceration. Today, one focus of debate, and I think something of a red herring here, is a focus on police body cameras. Body cameras will not solve police brutality. The problem is not a lack of evidence, and the problem is certainly not a lack of high-tech toys for the police. We should pursue strategies that work to lessen state violence rather than ones that further empower or augment the prison industrial complex. Number 2, the prison industrial complex affects us all differently. Black people and other people of color, as we've all laid out, bear the brunt of state violence. it is a sad fact that in 2015, it is necessary to assert that Black Lives Matter, and that the slogan, as Stephanie so wonderfully illustrated, is such a continuation over the centuries. That in and of itself, right, that we need to keep insisting that Black Lives Matter justifies and in fact requires our outrage. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize everyone, regardless of our kind of social location, has a stake in ending the prison industrial complex. The PIC grows at the expense of the things that make us all safe. We all lose by living in a society that kills and cages so many people. More prison means fewer schools, fewer jobs, more pollution, less health care. More and better armed police means greater violence, polarization, and fear. The PIC enables and sustains and requires the uneven distribution of resources like education, healthcare, healthy food, and physical safety. Recognize that everyone has a stake in abolishing the prison industrial complex. Third, resist criminalization in all its forms. Criminalization seeks to separate the good from the bad, the deserving from the undeserving. I think institutions falter and movements fail when they give in to criminalization. So I think our challenge is to resist criminalization in policy where we encounter it, as well as in practice. And I think that includes the university. The University of Washington has recently added a section to its application process that requires potential students to disclose their conviction history when applying to the university. This move continues to jeopardize the ability of people with felony convictions to access public resources such as our university. And I think it is a part of our insistence that Black Lives Matter and a part of our challenge to the prison industrial complex to oppose such moves. Ultimately, I think a central lesson from the Black freedom struggle against criminalization is that this is a long haul struggle. And so I want to close with a reminder of both the urgency and the longevity of the fight. It is a quote from a former Black Panther named Assata Shakur, whose words have been taken up as a chant by demonstrators in Ferguson and elsewhere. For those who don't know, Shakur spent 6 years as a political prisoner in New Jersey in the mid-1970s before escaping and ultimately being granted exile in Cuba. And so, if you would like, in the spirit of what people in Ferguson have laid out for us, I encourage you to repeat after me, in quoting Assata, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and support one another.
We must love and support one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains."
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Thank you very much.